Testing, testing. My check, my check. One, two. Okay, I hear myself. My check, my check. You got it? Okay. My check, weakness one. You got it? Okay. My check, no windscreen here.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. No. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. You good?
If I already shook your hand, wash it. The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on a variety of maritime transportation safety and stewardship programs implemented and enforced by the Coast Guard. Actually, this hearing is going to cover everything. Exactly. John was kind enough to just put everything into this hearing. The subcommittee has held periodic reviews of the Coast Guard's regulatory regime to keep the committee updated and to provide the regulated community an opportunity to relay information on what effects, positive or negative, new program or updates to regulations have on industry. As we have done with previous regulatory hearings, we will review pending and final rules impacting the safety and security of our ports and waterways, as well as regulations affecting business practices and the viability of the U.S. flag. The continued review allows for oversight on implementation and how the regulations are impacting vessel safety, the flow of commerce through our ports, and the ability to grow jobs in the maritime sector. Maritime commerce is essential to the U.S. economy. That's why we're all here, right? While regulations must address concerns related to safety, security, and stewardship, they must also balance the importance of maintaining the flow of maritime commerce. Domestic shipping alone is responsible for 500,000 American jobs and $100 billion in annual economic output. In addition, 90% of all global trade and over 25% of our GDP moves via the sea. The federal government should foster an atmosphere where our maritime industry can compete and expand. And I've got a saying that I didn't make up, but if you control the ocean, you control the world. And that's why we're here. If you control the ocean, you control the world. The National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board recently released a report on the impact of Coast Guard regulations on the United States Flag Registry. The good news for the service is the board reported that U.S. regulations are not an impediment to the competitiveness of the U.S. flag fleet. The board provided recommendations on further improvements that can be made by the Coast Guard to support the U.S. flag fleet. What is an ongoing frustration is the lack of a unified approach within this administration to support programs that promote the U.S. flag fleet. In fact, we just had an issue yesterday where we found out that there was a U.S. flag, U.S. crewed MSP vessel sitting outside of a port while a foreign flag vessel got the contract to carry goods, and they're going to be late. So you had a U.S. flag, U.S. crewed vessel empty, an MSP vessel, which gets a U.S. taxpayer dollars stipend, sat there while a foreign flag vessel is going to be late to pick up a full load, a military load, to go from Jacksonville to Kuwait. That's a huge screw up. And you would think as well as we're doing and what we know now, that kind of stuff wouldn't happen, but it happens every day. And in fact, the head of Transcom didn't even know it was happening until yesterday, until I talked to him. That's a sad state of affairs. The Coast Guard and the Environmental Protection Agency have developed separate regulations under two different federal laws to govern ballast water discharges. Although the agencies have worked together to try to reach uniformity, the programs still differ in implementation dates, vessels covered, geographic reach, enforcement, and penalties for noncompliance. For instance, the Coast Guard rules allow for vessels owners to seek an extension if treatment technologies do not exist or cannot be installed by the deadline. The EPA provides no mechanism for an extension, leaving a vessel owner liable for civil and criminal penalties through no fault of their own. This blows my mind. You have an 80% solution on ballast water. You have an 80% solution that exists now. You can do ballast water so you can drink it if there was no salinity, but it's not good enough for the Coast Guard. It blows my mind. So let's do extensions to dump dirty water instead of taking an 80% solution to kind of fix things. Let's just keep going. We'll talk later. The situation only becomes more confusing and burdensome for vessel owners as each individual state adds its own ballast water discharge requirements on top of the EPA's program. Under the EPA's current program, numerous states and tribes have added their own differing discharge standards. Some states have laws in place for forcing vessel owners to treat their ballast water to a standard for which no technology has yet been invented. The situation is ridiculous. It is completely unreasonable to ask vessel operators to comply with two federal standards and as many as 25 different contradictory and unachievable state and tribal standards. I hope my colleagues will join me in looking at ways to rectify this issue in any way possible. Lastly, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was amended by the International Maritime Organization in 2014 to require verified gross weights of containers before they are loaded on vessels. Implementation of the provision goes into effect on July 1st, 2016. I look forward to the witnesses' views on how to implement this requirement in a manner to ensure U.S. exports continue to move unimpeded, because what we really want to see is more burdens placed on small businesses that are shipping things. Not really. That was a joke. We want to do fewer things that impede the flow of commerce and the ability for the American people to keep their jobs, maintain their livability in the United States, and make money. If we want to grow our economy and remain a world power capable of defending ourselves and our allies, we must work together to strengthen and preserve our maritime industry. I thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimony. And with that, I yield to the great ranking member, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about your illness, and I expect I'm going to separate myself from you. Not in your testimony, which covers most everything I have to say here, so I'm going to just shorten this and put my comments into the record. But welcome the witnesses, Admiral and Mr. Michael. Thank you very much for being here. Mr. Michael, I'm particularly interested in hearing your testimony about how we might do the regulations and the whole process a whole lot better. And so I really want to focus on that. It's obviously vital for the Coast Guard regulations to be targeted, fair, and reasonable, and to get them done on time, all of which seems to be a very difficult task for the Coast Guard to achieve. Eventually, you do get it right, and we thank you for that. Eventually makes it tough when those years go by. I think I'll just submit this for the record and get on with the testimony. You covered all of it very well in your statement, Mr. Chairman, so I'll do that. And with your permission, I'd like to introduce in the record a statement by Congresswoman Doris Matsui dealing with passenger safety on cruise ships, and also a statement from the American Commodity Corporation dealing with what seems to me to be the current issue du jour of the day, which has to do who's responsible for the weight of a container.
Without objection.
Thank you.
On our first panel, we'll hear from Rear Admiral Paul Thomas, Deputy Commandant for Prevention Policy for the United States Coast Guard, and Mr. Keith Michel, Committee Chair for the Transportation Research Board of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Admiral, thanks for being here. Keith, thanks for being here. And Admiral, you're recognized.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your continued strong support of our Coast Guard and for the opportunity to talk with you today about our maritime prevention program. As you know and as you said, maintaining and sustaining a robust maritime industry and maritime transportation system is a national security imperative, and our Coast Guard prevention program plays a key role. The Coast Guard concept of operations for prevention brings to bear our unique authorities and capabilities on the task of ensuring a safe, secure, environmentally sound, productive, and efficient global maritime transportation system, and on helping the maritime industry meet the triple challenge over the coming decades of growing capacity while reducing environmental footprint in the face of ever-increasing complexity. We do this by developing smart, risk-based standards, which include both domestic and international regulations, by providing a well-trained workforce in our ports that can ensure compliance with those standards and provide the level playing field the industry demands, and by conducting investigations into accidents and violations of law so that both the standards and the compliance procedures can be improved, as we are currently doing in the case of the El Faro. Thanks in large part to oversight provided by this committee, we have made significant improvements in our regulatory development program since 2009. We've added staff, reduced backlogs, cut our average age of our projects, and implemented process improvements. Most of the significant rules that we develop are developed in response to congressional mandates. In every case, we work closely with all of our stakeholders, including the public and the industry, to ensure congressional intent is met while providing maximum regulatory flexibility and minimum burden. A perfect example is the Subchapter M towing vessel regulation, which will apply to about 6,000 towing vessels and will effectively double the size of the U.S. inspected fleet. This will significantly challenge the Coast Guard in terms of our resources. As a result, we will rely heavily on the use of third parties to meet the inspection and audit demands and to provide the industry the needed flexibility. We have developed a robust implementation plan for Subchapter M, and we will bring industry into our implementation team as soon as the rule publishes. We've already developed a very comprehensive outreach plan that engages both internal and external stakeholders. But we know from experience that the publication of the final rule is really just the end of the first phase, and we're focused on smooth implementation. You mentioned our ballast water regulation, for example, which was published 4 years ago, and we are still in the implementation phase. Some of the challenges associated with that rule are due to overlapping jurisdictions between the Coast Guard and the EPA and between the states and the federal governments. We appreciate the efforts of this committee to reduce those redundancies and to embrace standards based on best available technology that is both economically and operationally practical. We remain focused on type approval of ballast water management systems. You mentioned the TRB report, sir, and we welcome that report as part of our constant effort to improve our regulatory programs. As you mentioned, the report concluded that compliance with Coast Guard regulations is not an impediment to the competitiveness of the U.S. flag, and I agree. But I also agree with the recommendations that there's room for further improvement in the Coast Guard regulatory programs, and I've already taken steps in line with the committee's recommendations. Of the 3 recommendations in the report that are specific to the Maritime Security Program, 2 have already been enacted. To address the remaining recommendations, I have established a working group with industry operators to review and prioritize and suggest courses of action for each, and that group has its first meeting next week. We thank the TRB team for their efforts on our behalf. And finally, you mentioned the SOLAS requirements. The SOLAS amendments that have become known as the Container Weight or VGM amendments. As these amendments were developed at the IMO, our delegation was mindful of the existing regulatory structure in the U.S., which already ensures that the weight of a container is known before it is shipped over road or rail, is lifted at a terminal, or is loaded at a port on a ship. And it's precisely because of this underlying regulatory framework that additional regulations are not needed in the U.S. The SOLAS amendments may, however, require a change in the status quo in terms of how weights are verified and how that information is transmitted. I have been in contact with the key stakeholders, including those who will testify today, to ensure they understand the amendments and understand the flexibility that exists to achieve compliance. I will continue to facilitate discussions with them as they finalize their compliance strategies. There is no reason these amendments should cause any delays in our supply chain. Thank you again for your support, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Michel.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Mr. Garmendi, and members of the committee. My name's Keith Michel. I'm president of Webb Institute, a college that focuses on naval architecture and marine engineering. I spent 40 years designing ships, but I'm here representing National Academy Committee. That was a committee mandated by Congress, tasked by the U.S. Coast Guard with evaluating whether Coast Guard regulations are an impediment to the competitiveness of the U.S. flag fleet. The committee met once, heard from industry, and had many discussions amongst committee members. And we came out with the conclusion, as was mentioned earlier, or the finding, that Coast Guard is not an impediment to competitiveness. The reasoning was that we found that if you consider the increased costs of U.S. flag ships over their international counterparts, the percentage of that increased cost that we could attribute to the Coast Guard was less than 1%. Having said that, we found there were a number of areas where Coast Guard could improve processes and further reduce costs. So the report concentrates on that. There are 9 recommendations. The first 3 relate to the Maritime Security Program. That program was put in place quite a few years ago with the intent that there be a seamless transition from international flag to U.S. flag. And there's been some challenges with the program, as we've heard from industry. The cost of reflagging is in the range of $500,000 to $1 million. It includes about $250,000 related to requirements over and above the IMO related to engine room alarms and systems. So there's a significant cost in that transition. Once a ship is in MSP, there are ongoing costs related to the fact that at least originally the Coast Guard implemented the CFR rather than the alternative compliance program. So there were issues with the costs of following the CFR, and especially involving replacement of equipment when it was required to be Coast Guard type approved equipment. And finally, there were concerns with the MSP program. Coast Guard initially required that ships run with a watchstander in the engine room for up to 3,000 hours upon transition. These are ships that were operating in the international fleet without a watchstander. They had already been approved for unattended engine room operation and had been operating that way. With the requirement that the watchstanding occur for up to 3,000 hours, that's an additional cost burden on the ship owner, because that person could have been doing other work, maintenance work. The Coast Guard in May of 2015 made a number of changes. They've softened the impact of the reliance on CFR by allowing what they call MSP Select. After 3 years, a ship can largely follow the ACP processes, which are more efficient. The committee recommends that be the case immediately rather than waiting 3 years. The committee also recommends the Coast Guard look at, rather than using Coast Guard type approval for these vessels, they consider allowing classification society approval for equipment. Again, these ships are built under international registry. The systems are all in place, and when you have to replace it with a Coast Guard, due to maintenance, if you have to replace equipment with Coast Guard type approved, it can be quite costly. So and also the committee recommended that the requirement for watchstanding be reduced to 1,000 hours, and that consideration be given to eliminating it altogether if the crew is familiar with that particular ship and its automation systems. So those were 3 recommendations related to MSP. There were a series of other recommendations. The committee recommends that Coast Guard, with assistance from industry, look at the CFR regulations and do a risk-based assessment. That's a very extensive effort. That's recognized. It will take time, so we recommended the Coast Guard prioritize and working with industry determine which of the regulations are most burdensome. There's also a recommendation that in general, Coast Guard reconsider the equipment type approval, which can be quite burdensome on ship owners because most equipment is not U.S. type approved. The reason being the U.S. market is relatively small. And so if construction could use more of the internationally approved equipment, and if Coast Guard could rely on the approval processes of classification societies, the committee felt that would be more efficient without compromising safety. And finally, the committee recommends that Coast Guard rely even more on classification society and have less redundant inspections, but that it enhance its audit program over class. Again, this has become an issue after the committee met, more in focus because of the El Faro accident. The Coast Guard's evaluating how well its whole ACP process is working. So we understand that this recommendation will have to be evaluated, taking into consideration what the Coast Guard learns from its El Faro evaluation. And so those are the key recommendations. There were a few others in the report that are, the report again is available on the NAE website. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michel. I'm going to start recognizing members for questions, starting with myself. So let's just go really quickly to the U.S. flag fleet. So the Coast Guard, you said, is only responsible for 1%. You said there's a 1% of the cost of being a U.S. flag vessel. Go ahead.
Yeah, what it is we evaluated for a typical container ship the increased cost of operation, and we determined the dominant factor is crew costs. Crew costs, U.S. crew costs, about 5 times international crew costs.
Why is that? We're just better at it?
I think industry is better to answer it than me, but
Go ahead,
you know,
give it a shot. But you're sitting there, so
yeah,
give it a
no,
shot.
You know, I think there's probably a variety of reasons. You know, the higher standard of living is obviously part of it. Maybe there was less competitiveness with the unions and the shipping companies. There's a number of reasons, but it's substantially higher. And it's the dominant factor. So again, we estimated, if you looked at the increased cost alone versus total operating costs, crew costs were roughly 57%. Whereas the next most significant item was, as I remember, P&I insurance is higher because of the way the Jones Act treats accidents on ships, and the dry docking costs are higher because there's a tax, a Verlaine tax, if you do your dry dockings overseas, and they're much more expensive in the U.S. Those three, and then Coast Guard was only 1% of the additional costs that we attributed. So
That's great to hear.
it's significantly reduced over time. Again, the
What was it?
ACP program. What's that?
What was the Coast Guard's
We-
influence 20 years ago?
You
Meaning
know,
that
I would
1%,
guess
what
it
was
was 10 times higher than that. It's significantly lower. And likewise, we talked to shipyards in the U.S. about the cost of construction and the Coast Guard impact on that over and above if they were working towards an international flag. And there, as I remember, it was about 1% of the cost of construction was related to the requirements of Coast Guard over and above other international standards. So it's significantly reduced.
Thank you. The ranking member of the full committee's here. If we knew he was coming, we would have got a bigger room. That's why everybody's here. He would have given us one, that's right. Admiral, I guess I've got about 2 minutes left, so let's just talk ballast water. And I've talked to your staff and understand you're fully prepared to talk about it. Right now, is the Coast Guard giving waivers to ships to dump ballast water untreated totally?
No, sir. And I'm glad you asked that question so I can clarify that issue.
Yeah.
When we grant a waiver, there has to be some mitigating measures. Most of the vessels are mitigating the risk associated with invasive species by doing mid-water ballast water exchange or mid-ocean ballast water exchange, which is a protective measure that we've had in place for years. So it's absolutely misleading to.
Which is what? What does that mean?
So if you load ballast water in a port, there are many, many more critters in a port environment than there is in mid-ocean.
Because there's people.
Well, and sewage and other things.
Stuff.
So, but mid-ocean, as you exchange your ballast water, you're bringing on water that has many fewer critters. And in fact, once we have type-approved systems, that mid-ocean ballast water exchange won't be required.
So what you're saying is you'll grant waivers if you do a mid-ocean ballast water
Or there's some
exchange
other alternatives.
or other mitigating circumstance.
Right.
And how long have ships been doing that?
Well,
like
ships have been doing ballast water exchange
30,
for,
40, 50,
well, not
years?
quite that long, but a couple,
12 years?
yeah.
What did they do before that?
They did nothing, and that's one of the problems, one of the reasons we have zebra mussels and other invasive species in our ports.
So up to the early 2000s, they did nothing. And then around the early 2000s, they started doing ballast water exchanges, right? 1996.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Okay, so in 96, started doing mid-ocean ballast water exchanges. And if you do that, then you get a waiver? Or if you do something like that?
Yeah, there are other options as well.
Okay, sure. So if you do one of those other options, which are what?
You can use public drinking water supply for your ballast, which is not really practical, but it's one of the options. You can use what we call alternative management systems, which are systems that are approved to the SOLAS standard.
And if you do one of those things and you show the Coast Guard, hey, we're trying to mitigate, then what does the Coast Guard do?
So what the Coast Guard is saying is, hey, we understand industry that the systems that meet the standard that's required by our law are not yet there, but they are very close there. And since they're not yet there, we will grant a waiver to your compliance date that says you have to have one of those systems that meets our standard.
What is required by law? What does the law say?
Well, the law, sir, specifies as a certain discharge standard with regard to how many critters can be in how much volume of water. And it also requires that we determine that those critters are, we know that we have an efficacy test that we know is reliable and repeatable. So the efficacy test that we have now is one that is very reliable and repeatable across the broad spectrum of ballast water that we would see from ships coming around the world. And that's the one that says we can count how many things are alive versus how many are dead. And so that's what we are focused on, ensuring that we bring to the market, to the world market really, because it is the U.S. that's leading the world in this aspect.
But how many
systems
U.S. flagships do we have in the U.S. flag fleet?
Yes, sir. So that's a
Total.
very, very, very good point. We punch way above our weight with regard
But how many ships do we have in the U.S. flag fleet? I'm just asking.
internationally sailing.
U.S. flag international sailing vessels. How many do we have?
If you're talking about deep draft trading vessels, I've heard the Maritime Administrator use a number somewhere around 80. That's
80.
yes, sir.
And how many are in the world? Well,
Thousands.
just guess.
Yeah, thousands.
Tens of thousands?
Thousands.
100,000? 12,000 total. So 12,000 total ships, and we have 80. Okay.
Yes, sir. For many of the reasons that Mr. Michel mentioned.
Okay. So, do any ships right now use any kind of technology to mitigate their ballast water critters?
Yes, sir. I'm glad you asked the question. There are a number of systems out there, and hundreds of them on ships that have been approved under a scheme that was developed by the IMO. The IMO recently went back and reviewed the approval process for all of those systems and have determined that there's great variance in how the standards were applied and great deviation in terms of interpretation, so much so that there's really can be no confidence that the worldwide fleet has systems that will work, then it actually...
The worldwide fleet or the U.S. fleet?
Well, most U.S. fleet vessels have not yet installed ballast water systems, but those in the worldwide fleet who have chosen to have installed systems that they cannot have great confidence meet.
Then why
Meet
would
the
they?
standard.
Why would a private company install something if they don't? Why would they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for no reason?
It's a good question, sir. I can't answer the decision-making process there, but what I will say is they bought a system that was certified to the international standard, not to the U.S. standard, but the international standard is not robust enough to really drive the innovation and technology for systems that will meet this challenge.
Okay, so again, let me ask you: what does the U.S. law state?
The-
What does U.S. law state on ballast water?
So the U.S. law and the SOLAS International Convention
No, just
are exactly the
US
same.
law, all right.
They're exactly the same with regard to the discharge standard, or how many critters can come out at the other end of the machine. They're exactly the same. The difference comes with how do you prove to us that machine is actually meeting the discharge standard? That is the difference. And what I'm telling you is
But U.S. law doesn't give you a number.
it does.
It doesn't state an actual number. It allows you to state the number.
Right, yes, sir.
There's
Right, the
no-
standard. We set the.
So once again,
And law.
U.S. law, what does U.S. law say? What does the United States law that Congress passed and the President signed, what does that say when it comes to ballast water critters?
It requires us to set a standard based on best available technology.
Okay. Requires you to set a standard based on best available technology.
And the standard we currently have
What
is synced with the
Let's
international
go slow.
standard.
Let's just go slow. I'm a slow Marine, all right?
Yes,
Let's
sir.
just go slow.
Got that.
So that's what U.S. law states. Then you lay Coast Guard regulation on top of that, and what does Coast Guard regulation say?
So Coast Guard regulation sets a discharge standard, which is the same as the standard in the international convention. So it's a worldwide discharge standard, which, since this is a worldwide global industry, seems to make sense. And you pointed out that it doesn't make sense to have individual state standards, and we would agree with that.
So what is the best available technology, in your opinion, right now for ballast water treatment?
So, sir, we currently have 19 systems actively testing to our standards. 9 of those systems are UV systems. Those manufacturers are investing lots of money to run their systems through our test battery, and they are very confident that the technology they currently are working with will meet the U.S. standard.
So let's get down, let's just really quickly, because I was confused about this yesterday when we were talking about this on our pre-hearing meetings. What is the Coast Guard regulation for what happens to the actual critters?
So there's a number of critters per volume of water over a certain size that have to, the maximum number that can be
Do you
detected.
want to murder those critters? Or do you want to just render them harmless?
So that,
And you've heard the term rendered harmless, right?
yes, sir. I've
Now,
heard
why
it.
is that? Why do you know the term rendered harmless?
Viable versus non-viable is how I hear it in this context. But let me,
But rendered harmless,
what we want to do
wait,
is.
talk to me. Wait, Admiral, hang on.
Yep.
Rendered harmless. Have you heard of that term before?
Yes, I have.
Okay, why have you heard that? Is that in Coast Guard regulation?
Render harmless. I don't-
Rendered harmless. Critters. Rendered harmless.
I'll have to go back and see if render harmless is in Coast Guard regulations, sir.
Okay, so here's the actual, this is their code, right? So here's your code, let me tell you. Ballast water management system means any system which processes ballast water to kill, render harmless, or remove organisms. Okay?
Yes,
So,
sir.
so those, any of those three. It doesn't say and,
Right.
it's any of those.
The
So you-
trick, sir, comes in
Tell me.
developing the test, the efficacy test for the system to determine whether the system is actually killed or rendered harmless. And what I'm telling you is, there is a reliable, repeatable efficacy test to determine if something is dead. There is not a reliable, repeatable efficacy test to determine if they've been rendered harmless.
And by rendered harmless means they can't procreate.
They can't procreate, but due to the wide spectrum of species that we're talking about from ballast water all around the world, the fact that you don't even know which species you're trying to render harmless, it's difficult to prove that you've cultured enough of them to know whether or not they're able to reproduce. That is essentially the problem. So ballast water, so land-based water treatment systems, for example, are designed and constructed and operated for a known source of water that's to be treated. That water can be very well understood. You can know specifically which creatures you want to kill or
It's
render
the,
harmless.
Colorado River. You know what state it's going through, you know where it's going, right?
And you know, so you can not only tailor this treatment system to that specific water, you can tailor the efficacy test to that water. Ballast water comes from all over the world. So you can't tailor the treatment system or the efficacy test. So you need a test that's reliable and repeatable for water from anywhere. And that test today is dead, not rendered harmless.
Okay, so let me ask you, so right now, what you can do is simply dump the water and mix it in the middle of the ocean.
Which avoids bringing invasive species into our ports.
As opposed to using technology to get an 80% solution.
With the 80%
Or even,
solution.
or even a possible 100% solution. But the answer is you don't know. Because you can't test it.
Absolutely, sir. And in our interpretation of congressional intent, it wasn't put regulations that leave some doubt in terms of whether or not.
Here's what I don't understand. So let's just get, I'm using too much time because I really don't understand this, right? This always blows my mind. So we allow ships to simply dump and mix their ballast water in the middle of the ocean as opposed to setting guidelines for saying, hey, we think that this works, we're pretty sure it works, but we're not going to count that. We just want you to dump the water in the middle of the ocean and mix it up. I don't understand why not get an 80% solution? Why not say, hey, we're pretty sure that we watched the organisms for 2 years and they haven't procreated yet, but maybe they'll last 10 years and they may. And
So 2 points I should make.
Yeah.
First is the 80% solution that you've referred to is still currently under review by the Coast Guard, so it has not been eliminated.
but you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Right now, they simply dump it in the ocean, right? They take their
Sir.
ballast water and they
Right.
mix it, right?
But there's no evidence that dumping ballast water in mid-ocean does environmental damage.
Then why do we worry about it at all?
Because when you dump it in a port environment, sir,
Right.
that's a very different story than in the mid-ocean. That's how we move species from one port to another. That's how you get zebra mussels and Asian carp in waterways where we don't want them. So there's a real difference. And we're not talking about a pollutant like oil. We're talking about moving species around the world.
Okay. Once again, there's no there's no technology right now that the Coast Guard says, hey guys, go with this. This is the best way that we know how to do it. This is as close as we can get right now in 2016.
So there
There's-
are at least 19 systems currently testing in our
We're
labs.
not testing. There's
that-
nothing that the Coast Guard has said, hey guys, go with this one
We don't have a Coast Guard type approved system.
at all.
We do not have a Coast Guard type approved system at all, including the systems that provide the 80% solution. And precisely
Is the
because
Coast Guard
they-
scared to back one of these? I mean, what's
back one, sir?
yeah, to support some technology. Why not support the best technology
We are
that's out there right now?
We are committed to the proven process of type approval. We are learning lessons from a less robust process undertaken by other flags that have resulted in the systems that IMO have identified as ineffective. And so we're committed to get to a solution that actually meets the standard, and I'm confident that we will very soon. And in the meantime,
What kind of solution are you thinking? If you're confident, then tell me. What is
there-
that going to
there are-
be? What's your
there are-
guess?
There are 19 systems using various technologies today that are testing, and I expect we'll see some data soon that indicates those systems meets the current Coast Guard requirement, and then we'll be at 100% solution, sir.
Okay. And what system might that be?
There are a number of them out there. Some of them are the UV systems.
No, I'm not asking what you're testing. I'm asking what you think the technology will be.
Again, I think that this challenge is one that requires way more than one system, because every ship is different, every flow rate is different, every type of water system. So there needs to be a robust pool of these systems that use various types of technologies, and that's what's currently being tested. No one system, even if we had one system approved today, sir, it would not
Okay. Well,
be
then
effective on every ship.
Then which technologies? Instead of one, which one?
Well, there are some that use UV only. There are some that use UV with some other chemical processes. There are some that use chlorine. There are a various number of different
And
technologies.
which ones do you think are the ones that will do the job
Well,
in the near future?
I think the UV systems, there are 2 UV manufacturers who are already advertising that they can meet the Coast Guard standard. Some have already sold systems with guarantees that they will meet the Coast Guard standard. So, those systems are promising.
All right. Man, it's hard to, okay, complicated issue.
It is very complicated. That's why I appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion with you on it.
I yield to the ranking member.
Hearing downstairs, we should have exchanged rooms because we have fewer people for that hearing, even though it is important. In any case, Admiral, the SOLAS requirements on shipping on containers are of particular concern to shippers in the Pacific Northwest of agricultural products. And the Coast Guard has taken a position that you feel that the U.S. With our current systems is in compliance, and that it won't require dramatic changes. They have an opposite opinion, which is that this potentially becomes disruptive because it involves coming to a determination of both the weight of the content and the container. The containers are beyond the control of the agricultural producers, but they feel that they're going to be essentially having to sign off on something over which they don't have total control. And there's a good deal of confusion out there. How is it that you know or feel or can state that we are currently in compliance with these new standards? And if we are in compliance with these new standards, then I would assume that there will not be the sort of disruptions that some in the industry are anticipating.
Right, thanks for that question, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. In my statement, sir, I mentioned that we have a number of regulations in the U.S. already, not Coast Guard regulations, that require the weight of a container to be known before it's moved by road or rail or moved at a terminal. So the information required to be in compliance is already being generated. There may be a need for some business practice changes. Part of the confusion, though, is being generated by a lack of understanding of the flexibility that exists within the SOLAS requirement, both in terms of how the regulation itself is written and in terms of the general provisions within the convention for equivalencies. So I have seen a number of documents floated by IMO, by the World Shipping Council, by OSEMA, and by agricultural exporters, each of which defines a path to legal compliance with the SOLAS requirements, each of which will result in compliance with the SOLAS requirements. So this is for exporters and carriers to work out in terms of which of those methods they're going to use with each other. But there's no reason that the regulation, there is no government agency, no regulation, no international regulation that will cause a disruption in our supply chain. If it's disrupted, it's because the shippers and the carriers haven't been able to figure out which of those many methods that meet the SOLAS requirements they're going to employ.
So you're saying it's really a dispute between different businesses involved in the supply chain over what they would feel would comply. I mean,
I don't know that it's a dispute. Again, I think that there's been a large amount of misunderstanding of the flexibility that's already provided by the regulation. I think that misunderstanding is starting to be cleared up, and maybe you'll hear today from the panel that they are beginning to have productive discussions on how they're going to meet this challenge. But again, there's no reason that a regulation should cause this regulation should cause a disruption in our supply chain.
okay, well then I will have staff here and I'll hear about that, and I may want to get back to you after we hear from the witnesses and after I clarify with some of the Northwest shippers. And just, Mr. Chairman, on the issue of ballast water, I think that we had hearings on this in the early 90s, as I recall, and you know, we had heat, we had chemical, we had you know, using the UV and the exchange, and none of them, I mean, have ever proved to be 100% effective. But it seems to me that a requirement both of a mid-ocean exchange and an effective approved treatment system is going to get us closest to the point, because it doesn't take very many of these things, like zebra mussels or other quagga mussels. These sorts of things takes very few to become essentially a plague, you know, and a significant invasion. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir, and that's why we're striving
Right.
for the 100% solution.
Right, and would 100% perhaps be a combination, which would be both the mid-ocean exchange, which does help to some extent but isn't perfect, and a treatment system?
You know, I think once we have approved systems out there, we'll continue to monitor how well they perform and determine whether or not there needs to be that second step.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member for being here. Mr. Gibbs, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, not to beat the ballast water to death. The Chairman did a pretty good job, but that's where my questions are going to, since I'm from Ohio and represent the Great Lakes region. And start with my understanding that on the EPA, they can states can add additional requirements on the whatever the rules might be. Is that true?
So as you know, there's two federal statutes that govern this, one Coast Guard Invasive Species Act and the EPA. And neither of those federal statutes provide for preemption of the states. And so yes, absolutely, it's true. The states can tack on additional requirements.
States can, okay. 'Cause that's a real concern. If you look at how the Great Lakes region works with the St. Lawrence Seaway, and, you know, so it makes sense that, I know the Coast Guard and EPA is trying to harmonize some of these separate laws, regulations. I think from your earlier comment, you are a supporter of doing that to get to a single regulatory policy. And if that's the case, would the Coast Guard be the agency to perform that then?
Well, I would say the Coast Guard and the EPA can't harmonize the requirements. Congress has to do that. Our objective is one single federal standard that does preempt the states.
That's good clarification. I meant to say it that way. Yeah.
Right.
But your support of the Congress does that because it makes just move interstate commerce, and especially in the Great Lakes region, it makes sense, right?
It makes sense given the nature of this industry, but we appreciate the opportunity. We've had to work with this committee staff on drafting some language that might get to that problem.
Okay. Back on the technology, my understanding is that the International Maritime Organization, IMO, has approved UV technology, but the Coast Guard hasn't. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's correct. So that goes back to the difference between the Coast Guard and the IMO standard lies in the robustness of the type approval system or process. In other words, how do you actually prove that that box really does kill those critters? And what we found, and the IMO themselves have gone back and found that the guidelines they have for type approval are probably not robust enough. In fact, they're in the process of revamping those to make them look a lot more like the U.S. One of the reasons that we haven't approved all the systems, or any of the systems that the IMO has, is because our process is more robust.
Okay. So right now, our shippers, vessel owners, are kind of just hanging in limbo because if they want to put in some newer technology, they don't know if it's going to get approved or not. So we have all these extensions as a
I
result.
would say yes, they're hanging in limbo, but they're hanging in limbo because of the pending ratification of the International Convention, to which we are not signatory. They're not hanging in limbo because of the U.S. regulations, because we are granting the waivers until the technology is available.
Okay. Has any other country established vessel ballast water treatment standards that, that specifically require ballast water management systems to kill these organisms? Has any countries done that or not?
So again, if you look at the IMO guidelines on type approval of international systems, the standard is dead. The fact of the matter is that a number of administrations, because those guidelines are not mandatory, have approved systems that don't kill things. They apparently are satisfied with the efficacy tests. We have not yet been able to determine that the efficacy tests are reliable and repeatable. We continue to look at that. There's an appeal that's currently under review by the Coast Guard. We've got some new data. If we can determine that those tests are reliable and repeatable across the broad spectrum of species that you see in ballast water, then we'll be in a better position to type approve those systems.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Garamundi.
Admiral Thomas, this ballast water thing's going round and round here, and I
Yes, sir.
appreciate your attempt to try to clarify and to inform us. You said something here a moment ago in exchange with the chairman that there were 3 different standards: dead, not viable, and the third one. And then you just said dead, the international standard dead. I assume dead means not viable as in dead. Is that
Not
correct?
alive, sir.
Not alive.
As opposed to alive,
No,
but
that's-
not viable.
It's the non-viable that seems to be questionable here. Is that the case?
Yes, sir. I think intuitively you say, if I can render this organism so it can never reproduce, that's effectively dead for the intent of the regulation. And quite honestly, I would agree with that. The problem is demonstrating that you have in fact done that for every one of the organisms that might be in that ballast water.
No.
It's easier to demonstrate that they're dead than it is that they're non-viable.
Now, that's where I want to go. Is part of this problem the fact that we have at least 2, and I think there was a third standard. Was there a third standard also? Or just the 2? Dead and not viable. Is that correct?
Oh, well, yeah, the Congress chairman said rendered harmless, which I've come to know as viable versus non-viable.
Okay, so, okay, we will stipulate that non-viable and
Is harmless?
rendered harmless are the same, and that's the second standard. If the standard were simply dead, would it be more likely and more feasible that the test and the replication of the test would be better achieved?
It is better. I mean, so the efficacy tests for dead are reliable and repeatable. And if the standard were simply dead, then the industry that both needs to operate these things and need to manufacture these things would have a larger degree of certainty.
So why are we
And we would have the
dealing-
technology on board those vessels.
Why then do we even consider rendered harmless or not viable?
I think because the regulation is intended to be enduring, and there's a very good chance that in the future we'll develop an efficacy test that may actually be effective to determine viability across the full subset. But today it doesn't exist. At least we have not been able to, the data that we've been submitted, that has been submitted to us to substantiate this, we've run it through independent
Who
labs
then-
and experts, and we haven't been able to get to that same conclusion.
Well, we seem to be hung up on a shoal here called viable or non-viable, huh?
The viability shoal.
The viability shoal. So why don't we just dredge this thing out and say dead?
Well, sir, effectively, we have, but we are still open to
Who
innovators who can
created-
come in and show us that they've been able to achieve the same standards through non-viability.
Who created the option? Is it the Coast Guard that created the option, or
It's
we the
yes.
responsible party here?
We put it in our regulation. I will tell you, and I wasn't involved in that, but there was a lot of discussion in the course of public comment about this very issue of whether it has to be dead or whether you should leave the option of non-viability.
How many years have we been wrestling with this question of non-viable or rendered harmless?
It's been a part of the debate for ballast water for as long as we've been talking about ballast water.
Which is 1990s?
96 or so, yes, sir.
It seems to me there may be a solution. Dead's dead. That we can agree with on all of these critters. Is that correct?
We can agree that dead is dead.
And we can, and we can agree that it's going to be dead for all the critters.
And for the rest of their lives.
And so the industry, wherever they may be coming from. And so the industry basically has been hung up on trying to wrestle with this not viable or rendered harmless.
Well, again, I would tell you, the ballast water treatment industry is working hard to get to the dead. And there are 19 systems currently on, that those manufacturers are confident they're there, or else they would not have invested in the rigorous course of testing protocols.
And the industry's hung up.
And
It just seems to me that, I'll just make a statement, and then we'll try to wrestle with this. It seems to me as though we understand dead, and you're able to replicate tests that a system kills it. They're dead.
Yes.
You're not able to replicate the question of viable, non-viable, rendered harmless. That's where the hang-up is. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. The efficacy test for non-viability is not reliable.
And we have more than a dozen different systems that will kill.
Under testing
Period.
today, yes, sir.
Well, it seems to me that the solution lies in eliminating the question of whether something is viable or not. And simply say, if you're going to install a system, it's going to require that all of the critters are dead. Correct? And then we don't have any question.
I think you'll get a different opinion when you hear from the industry panel on that, because they would like to retain the flexibility for future innovation.
And therefore, the entire industry is hung up, and we're left with mid-ocean
Right.
exchange.
That's why we're working hard on systems that we know will actually meet the standard.
Well, I'll be interested to hear the witnesses. I think I'll let it go at that. Thank you.
Mr. Sanford is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I guess first question is, are we making the perfectly enemy good with regard to the ballast water discharge issue? I mean, we've had different iterations of the same question. I've been approached by a number of different users in Port of Charleston on this issue. It seems to be important. They've brought up the UVA the UV technology and suggested that, you know, if it's good enough for the international standard, why isn't it good enough? A little bit, would you just flesh that out just a little bit as to why we couldn't go with something that would give them certainty or a greater degree of certainty? It may not be the perfect, but it would be the good, and it'd allow them to move forward, particularly on the UV front, given some of the comments that they've offered in my direction.
Right, so just to reiterate, there are UV systems are still viable with regard to being able to meet our standard. There are at least 8 or 9 of them currently being tested to the dead standard.
Right.
The question about why don't we just use the systems that have already been approved under international regime is answered really by the study that the IMO did on those systems. And when they looked at how those systems were approved and what data was used and how that data was interpreted, they found a wide variance and great deviation from even their own guidelines. And they concluded that we really have no certainty that these systems will work reliably and consistently. And in fact, that particular issue is what has thrown such a great deal of uncertainty into the international shipping industry. There are
But the net consequence is you extend over 5,000 waivers, as I understand it. So we've continued to extend waivers. So the net effect is the same. In other words, you'd still continue to move ahead. We were with uncertain technology. I mean,
so again, I'll remind you that it's not as if we are extending waivers with no mitigating actions in place. We are still requiring an action to mitigate the threat associated with invasive species. And while we do that, we are focused on a long-term solution that will really meet this challenge for the long term, and we are very close to getting there.
okay. Which would bring me to my second question. My colleague, Congressman DeFazio, had raised the SOLAS question. That too has come up back home in Charleston. And I think one of the questions with regard to, particularly on the shipper side, is to what extent is Coast Guard going to enforce the new regulations, which I think are, I guess it's July date, if I'm not mistaken. It's the summer sometime. I thought it was July, but and they want, you know, some degree of clarity, one on enforcement, two on penalties.
Great, thanks for that question. The first key point is that this is not a new regulation. This particular regulation has been in place since 1994. But there are amendments to the regulations that are going into place. And those amendments will not cause any changes in the Coast Guard's current enforcement stance for that particular regulation.
But it's July 1st, if I'm not mistaken, that the new regulations, or the new amendments to the regulation go into effect. Is that the case?
Yes, sir, but you asked about our enforcement stance on that.
Right.
What I'm saying is that the enforcement stance after 1 July will be the same as it is prior to 1 July. That is a SOLAS regulation, so we enforce that as a flag state on U.S. flag vessels, and we are confident that U.S. flag vessels already have the guidance they need to be in compliance with that standard. We enforce that as a port state on foreign flag vessels that come to U.S. ports, and our primary role there is to ensure that those vessels are operating in compliance with the requirements from their flag state.
So your point to the maritime community in Charleston would be there will be no big delta with regard to what they've seen
So
past versus present.
our authority, for example, on the port terminal is not derived from SOLAS. It's derived from Congress and from
Right.
the CFR. So the enforcement that we do on deck at a terminal will remain the same because nothing's changed. Nothing's been amended, nothing's changed.
Okay. Last question. I see you have 48 seconds. If you were to pick out the two most wasteful regulations that you're forced to enforce from a Coast Guard standpoint that probably have little in the way of effect, what would they be?
You would have to give me more time on that, but your point is,
Well, what would come off just top of your head? What would you say, you know, that's kind of a waste of time. We
In our
spend X
last-
number of man hours doing it, but, you know, it probably provides little in the way of utility or real difference in terms of environment or real difference in terms of
We've been
safety.
seeking legislative relief from the requirement in the Maritime Transportation Security Act, sir, that we have to go to every MITSA facility twice a year regardless of risk. We would prefer to be able to target our resources to the highest risk facilities. So a rock facility, for example, doesn't necessarily need to get visited twice a year, whereas a bulk liquid terminal, we'd like to have the freedom to do it more often.
That'd be one.
I thought that was good enough to count for.
I'll come back to you on that. Thank you, sir. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves is recognized.
Mr. Michel, Admiral, thank you for being here. Mr. Michel, in all the meetings we've had with industry in the last year and a half, I've heard a lot of concerns expressed about the cost of compliance by U.S. shippers as compared to some of their foreign competitors. The report that you provided and some of the summary information in your testimony doesn't seem to be consistent with a lot of the feedback or a lot of the information we're receiving from stakeholders. Could you speak to that disconnect? I mean, do you think this evaluation was robust? Do you think that there were some deficiencies? Could you help connect the dots here?
I feel the numbers are good in our report. It's not insignificant. The cost of reflagging at $1 million taking 3 days, when if you were reflagging the other direction, it would be 1 day and a fraction of the cost. It's not insignificant, but compared to the total increased cost of U.S. Flag operation, it's not a major part. And so we didn't consider it an impediment to U.S. flag competitiveness. We have 9 recommendations because we feel there's a lot of room for the Coast Guard to make further improvements and reduce costs. But it's not what we would call an impediment because it's a very small percentage of overall increased costs. So industry has a strong position that we have to be very careful about redundant inspections, about CFR requirements that require type approval and keep them from using current best available technologies in the most cost-effective way. Coast Guard needs to look at those type of issues, but when we add it all up, the numbers in the report are robust. That's a good estimate of the cost. It varies ship by ship, of course.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I just want to highlight the point that perhaps some of the estimates pertain to relative cost, and I'm anxious to hear from AWO and others in the next panel to understand that disconnect. Admiral, the Academy's report notes that significant improvements have been made in regard to efficiency, environmental improvements, and I think helping reduce cost of regulatory compliance. Does the Coast Guard meet on a regular basis with stakeholders to discuss with them their perspective in regard to compliance and ways to comply with regulations and ways to perhaps update existing regulations? Thank you. I want to change gears a little bit, but similar questioning. I'd like to talk about Coast Guard requirements for systems to be used aboard vessels navigating inland waterways, which is very different than ocean going. I'm not sure if it's legal or not, so I'll just say that I may or may not have driven a tow barge configuration through some Mississippi River bridges and other places.
I haven't done it either.
But industry, again, it's very different than ocean going. Even when I go out fishing, just fundamentally different navigation situation in those two scenarios. There has not been a standard for electronic charting systems for the past 15 years. And as you know, the industry has been working on their own to develop a standard. And you may recall that Congressman Abraham and our office and a few others sent you a letter last year on this topic. I understand that you may be coming to the point where you're going to finalize some type of recommendation or some type of standard. But I'd like to understand, if you're approaching a decision, how is that going to comply with or sync up with the efforts of the inland navigation community in what they've been doing over the last 15 years? As you know, compliance costs could be pretty hefty. I've seen numbers anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 per vessel, and just want to understand sort of how what they've been doing so far on their own to ensure safety is going to comply, or the consistency with what you believe your final recommendation could be.
Well, thanks for that question, because this is really a good news story here. I want to be clear, though. You mentioned the term compliance costs. We have issued a NAVIC on this topic, but it's not a regulation, and it does not require anyone to do anything. So there is no compliance to be had and no associated compliance costs. The NAVIC was issued in response to the demand signal from the industry that they wanted the Coast Guard to provide a pathway to remove paper charts that are currently required by our regulations. And as you said, the existing standards for electronic systems were just not appropriate for that part of the industry. They work for large ocean-going vessels. So we work hard with our FACAs and with other organizations that develop these types of standards internationally. We finally developed a good standard for this type of system. And that is the standard that's in the NAVIC that says if you have systems that meet this standard and you employ them in certain ways with certain redundancies, you can legally remove your paper charts. The problem is that the existing standards on the vessels that are out there already operating aren't built to this standard, which is not a surprise since it's a new standard, right? So the market hasn't built things to meet this standard because the standard's not just now out there. The fact of the matter is, though, that many of the systems that are already out there, if the manufacturers test them, they will meet the standard. And working with AWO and others, the big-time operators who buy lots of these systems are putting the pressure on the manufacturers to test their systems. And so this is a case where the market will drive the solution. eventually it may become a regulation, but if it does, it's a market and industry-driven regulation as opposed to implementing a regulation that then causes the market industry to catch up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to urge, Admiral, as you finalize this, I'll say it again, compliance with what they've been doing for the last 15 years, I think is pretty critical. They're the ones who have really been the leaders in regard to establishing technology and standards in this case. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I think that's all we have. I think what we established today is it's not Descartes, I think, therefore I am. It's I procreate, therefore I am. I think that's what we've figured out today. It's very philosophical, and hopefully that'll make some news, right? Yeah, right? Or you're considered dead. Yeah. So, hey, thank you both very much. Thanks for being here, Admiral, and thanks for what you guys do.
Thank you.
So, the witnesses for the second panel include Mr. Thomas Allegretti, President and CEO for American Waterways Operators, Mr. John Butler, President and CEO for the World Shipping Council, Mr. John Crowley, Executive Director for the National Association of Waterfront Employers, Ms. Donna Lem, Agriculture Transportation Coalition, Solus Committee Chair, and Vice President for Mallory Alexander International Logistics, and Mr. Kendall Carver, Chairman for the International Cruise Victims Association, Incorporated. We don't have to restart up because we've already started, and I introduced everybody while you were getting seated. So thank you all for being here and taking time. And I'm going to go ahead and just start from left to right. Mr. Allegretti, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. This hearing comes at a very consequential time, both for the tugboat, towboat, and barge industry and for our country. We face a year of great challenge and extraordinary opportunity, and we need the bipartisan leadership of this subcommittee to successfully confront these challenges and take maximum advantage of these opportunities that are before us. I come before you today with 4 requests. First and foremost, please continue to lead in vocally and actively supporting the Jones Act, and please strongly oppose the inclusion of measures to weaken the law and legislation that may originate in other committees. The Jones Act is critical to our nation's economic, homeland, and national security, to hundreds of thousands of good family wage American jobs, and to billions of dollars of investments made by American companies in American-built vessels. Those few but vocal critics who assert that the Jones Act raises the price of gasoline at the pump or that repeal of the Jones Act will solve Puerto Rico's economic woes are quite simply wrong. Repealing or weakening the Jones Act won't make it a penny cheaper to fill up your car, and it will have no effect on the Puerto Rican government debt. What it will certainly do is destroy the domestic maritime industry. It will kill American jobs, and it will undermine U.S. homeland security. A bad deal, if ever there was one. Second, please exercise your oversight responsibility and pay careful attention to the Coast Guard's implementation of the towing vessel inspection rule slated for publication this spring. The subcommittee's leadership was instrumental in the passage of the 2004 law that required this rulemaking and enjoyed AWO's strong support. We look forward to working with the Coast Guard to implement this rule that will raise the regulatory floor and take safety and environmental protection in our industry to a new and historic level without disrupting the efficient flow of maritime commerce. Please stay close to the implementation of this rule to ensure that it achieves both of those goals. Third, please reaffirm by your words and your actions the Coast Guard's preeminent role in the regulation of navigation and vessel operations. The safe and efficient flow of interstate commerce depends upon clear federal statutes and regulations consistently and uniformly applied nationwide. When states or localities muddy the waters by establishing their own requirements for vessels in interstate commerce, it not only does violence to the U.S. Constitution, but it places mariners, vessels, and the environment at risk. We urge you to support the Coast Guard in finalizing its proposed preemption statement and speaking out in opposition when states attempt to usurp the Coast Guard's regulatory authority. Fourth and finally, please pass the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act this year and put an end to the dysfunctional regulatory system in which 2 federal agencies and more than 24 states regulate ballast water and other vessel discharges in overlapping and inconsistent ways. We have a real window of opportunity for the 114th Congress to accomplish what previous Congresses have not, to establish a uniform science-based federal framework for the regulation of vessel discharges that's good for the environment, good for the economy, and good for the American taxpayer. Chairman Hunter, thank you for sponsoring this much-needed legislation, and we urge every member of the subcommittee to co-sponsor H.R. 980 and to communicate to Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member DeFazio your support for passage this year. Our industry very much appreciates the subcommittee's effective oversight of and your long record of support for the American maritime industry, and thank you for holding this hearing today and for the opportunity to appear before you.
For America. Mr. Butler, you're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I would ask that my full statement be included in the record. The World Shipping Council represents the liner shipping industry, and our members operate about 90% of global container ship capacity. Today, I'd like to address an amendment to the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS Convention, that becomes effective on July 1 of this year. You've heard a bit about this already today. That SOLAS amendment addresses a very serious safety problem that has affected the container shipping industry for many years. That safety problem is the fact that in far too many cases, the packed container weight provided to the carrier by the shipper is inaccurate. In response to this problem of misdeclared container weights, industry and governments began a discussion at the International Maritime Organization about how to fix the problem. That discussion at the IMO began in earnest in 2010 and continued over the next 4 years. Governments, shippers, labor, insurance providers, terminal operators, and carriers all participated. The United States government, through the U.S. Coast Guard, actively participated in that process. In 2014, the IMO member countries unanimously adopted a revised regulation under SOLAS that requires the shipper to provide an accurate gross weight for each packed container before that container can be loaded onto a ship for international transportation. The regulation provides two methods that the shipper can use to establish an accurate weight. Under Method 1, the container is weighed after it is packed. Under Method 2, the shipper weighs the cargo and the packing material and then adds that weight to the empty or tear weight of the container. And the tear weight of the container is conspicuously painted on the door of every container. The amended SOLAS regulation requires two things that the existing SOLAS regulation does not. First, the amended regulation explicitly requires that the loaded container must be weighed. Estimating weights is no longer allowed. Second, the amended regulation now explicitly states that the carrier and the marine terminal operator may not load a packed container unless the shipper has provided a verified weight. Without a verified weight, the carrier and the marine terminal cannot put the container on the ship. The compliance date is 2.5 months away. A tremendous amount of work has been done around the world to make sure that the new regulation can be implemented smoothly. Carriers, shippers, and terminal operators are in the process of adjusting their procedures and their communication channels in order to be able to share the verified gross weight information that needs to be provided before the container goes on the ship. Although companies worldwide are preparing for compliance and making very good progress, there is disagreement from a group of U.S. exporters that you'll hear from today. I addressed that situation in length in my written testimony, but to summarize, there's some shippers that would prefer to provide only part of the required weight information and to have the carrier then provide the other part. The problem with that approach is that it will not work with the information technology solutions the carriers have built to implement the SOLAS amendment. Those IT systems are designed to receive and process a complete verified gross mass number, a number that includes both the content of the container and the container weight itself. That's what the regulation says, and because that's what the regulation says, that's the way carriers have built their systems. So if shippers only provide the cargo weight, as a few wish to do, that would trigger a manual data handling process by the carriers. Such a manual process would not be able to efficiently handle the documentation flow. And that scenario, if it comes to pass, could lead to disruptions in cargo flow, and that's something everybody wants to avoid. Obtaining and using accurate weights to stow ships is a shared safety responsibility of carriers, shippers, and terminal operators. The amended SOLAS regulation spells out what each party in the chain needs to do. Those tasks are reasonable and necessary, and if everyone does their part, the system will work and will make international shipping safer and more efficient for everyone. I hope that we can use the time that we have now, between now and July 1, to work together toward that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. We'll just go all the way through. Mr. Crowley, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Appreciate the invitation to be here today and your recognition of the importance of marine safety throughout our maritime transportation chain. I represent the marine terminal operator and stevedoring industry. I, from a visual standpoint, look at them as that engine within the fence in our ports that make the economy work, that make the intermodal transfer work safely, productively for our businesses, exports and imports. Despite being a volume-based cycle time industry, safety is always job one for our industry members. Safety, it comes in many forms, but for today's purpose, we are looking at container weights. Containers originate from all over the world. They're carried by multiple flag vessels. They arrive at marine terminals both here and abroad. The importance of having a consistent safety standard is almost without question. Those safety standards the National Association of Waterfront Employers look forward to. We look forward to the amendments to ensure that that is continued, and that the condition, the contents, and the weight processes that are available in the records provided to us are dependable. For on the marine terminal, those inconsistencies, if they're wrong, show up immediately and have the potential of grinding operations literally to a halt. We look forward to increased productivity. Toward that end, our members have worked hard to re-engineer their processes, including technology solutions in concordance with our customers, those that Mr. Butler represents, and provide systems that are more agile, that provide a faster, better, safer system towards the improvement of our marine cargo transportation system. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to questions from you today.
You win the shortest testimony yet. You get a prize after this. Ms. Lim, you're recognized.
Should push the button. Good. Many of your constituents that are moving thousands and thousands of container ocean goods, specifically agricultural goods and forest products. These exports are critical to our economy, and they're critical to our nation. I'm the vice president at Mallory Alexander. We're based in Memphis, Tennessee, and our responsibility is to prepare the export documentation for exporters, as well as provide ocean services. I'm also the chair of the SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea Committee for Agricultural Transportation Coalition. Today, our coalition is very strong. We come here with one voice for both your small farmer in your district as well as your largest exporter in your district. The voice is one in unison for one reason. We are very, very concerned about these new regulations the World Shipping Council has announced, because there are only 2 methods that they have announced that are, in their minds, regulatory, and they're asking the shipper to abide. My goal today is first and foremost to share with you that the U.S. exporter is committed to safety. We also have in place today, as the Admiral said, a compliant method in which we report our weights to the ships. And we report both gross weights and net weights every day on our bill of ladings. This has been approved with the SOLAS regulation for decades. The problem, in a nutshell, is that there is flexibility, as the Admiral said, in the regulation. This is not a change in regulation. These are modifications. This is the heart of the disagreement. The guidelines that have been presented by the World Shipping Council are mandatory in tone. They are required in tone. They are not flexible. They are not commercial in setting. Let's go discuss this. And I'm here to tell you that the 2 methods proposed, the first one, scaling, is nearly impossible for most of your ag and forest product shippers. Why? Where are the scales? Just last week, we saw the southern ports of the West Coast announce that they were not ready or capable to weigh our containers. I live in New Orleans. There are no scales in New Orleans. Where are the scales? You know how expensive it is? $200 to $250 to weigh a container. Remember, they're asking us to certify. It's redundant. We are certifying today. The Admiral made reference to laws that exist today. We have the Intermodal Safety Act, which mandates that we certify the weights that we produce. We produce a bill of lading. Shipper load and count, certify. Second method that has been proposed is that we not only submit our gross weights, but we're also asked to submit the tare weight of a container we don't own or lease. We have members that their legal departments are saying there's no way we're going to allow you to certify or report on a weight on a piece of equipment you don't own or lease. The ramifications for port disruption are huge. We are at total opposite ends. Many exporters, I was just at a conference last week, don't even have a field for tare weight. These IT systems that we talked about today, honestly just started getting developed November, December. They have not been rolled out. There's no EDI standard. There are multiple portals, multiple carriers, multiple IT elements that the average exporter hasn't even begun to understand. So I'm outlining one, cost. I'm outlining two, this window. VGM is going to require a new cutoff, a totally new cutoff. We have one member that feel they move 10,000 containers. They believe they'll only be able to move half that number of containers because of this new window, this tighter window. These are huge ramifications. We believe that first and foremost, the solution is to recognize that the United States is not the problem. These incidents that they talk about do not happen off of our shores. In the spirit of working together with the carriers, we have tried for months now to find best practices. We have said that we will certify yet again in some kind of business arrangement, perhaps in contract, that our weights are true and correct. We've been met with the answer no each and every time. In summary, I ask this committee, please, to help us, even if it's through legislative processes, to acknowledge that the processes that exist today are indeed compliant, that there is flexibility in this regulation, and if in fact the ocean carriers refuse to cooperate, we ask you to please seek the opinion of the Federal Maritime Commission for this collective activity. In summary, I do ask, please, that you ask the Coast Guard for a written statement about the many methods in which we can report verified gross mass. I think there's some ambiguous discussion and confusion because it's only been in dialogue. We thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you, Ms. Lim. Mr. Carver, you're recognized.
I'd like to thank Chairman Hunter and Ranking Chairman Garamendi and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here. I serve as chairman of a group called International Cruise Victims. Prior to that, I spent 18 years in New York City as CEO of an insurance company, which we were in a similar business at that time. It was just 10 years ago that I sat here for the first time, one of 5 testimonies that I've given. And it resulted, the testimony, the hearing was called because Chris Shea, a Republican, had a hearing in December of 2005 raising questions about safety on cruise ships. At the hearing at which we testified, we had 6 victims tell their sad story, but we did something nobody suspected. We gave a 10-point program to improve safety. Simple program that anybody should accept. After several more congressional hearings, the cruise lines failed to accept any of these points. As a result, movement was made. The Congress shifted from the Republicans to the Democrats, so Senator Kerry picked up the cause, Representative Matsui, and the Cruise Vessel Safety and Security Act was passed. For the first time, a law was passed that mandated basic safety and security measures, some which were as fundamental as been in hotels forever. Man overboard systems, rights to victims, to contact the FBI directly, and other such provisions. In addition, victims on a cruise ship, U.S. citizens, are subject to the rights of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which is a separate legislation which gives victims rights. I'd like to say that these major steps to improve safety have improved safety, but it hasn't really worked. Generally speaking, the bill is not being enforced. We are hoping, however, that the final regulations will correct the deficiencies that we are concerned with. As an example, in 2006, there were 19 convictions of crimes on a cruise ship. In 2003, after the law took effect, there were 3 convictions of crimes on a cruise ship. We're moving backwards instead of forwards. There are several, most of the major items in the bill are not being enforced, and we ask the support of the committee with the regulations that have been developed. to make sure that they are issued in line with the goal of the passage of a bill that was passed with only 4 votes against it. First started by the Republicans for the first 2 hearings, and then taken over by the Democrats. In addition, new legislation has been introduced. House Bill 3142 needs to be passed to correct some of the deficiencies in the first bill and improve safety. It include the prompt reporting of crimes to the FBI, improve video surveillance, man overboard systems be installed on cruise ships, and improve medical standards. It was 10 years ago that ICV returned to our Republican Representative Chris Shea for help. Again, as I said, when the Democrats took over, the Democrats picked up the ball and ran to it. Chairman Hunter recently had several mothers in his office in Temecula with their sad story. These women were from your district. One was a woman whose daughter was raped by a crew member. And it's been covered by 60 Minutes in Australia, Anderson Cooper's show. Another mother was there who, on a family trip with 13 members of the family, lost a son. And he was a twin. His twin came to your office and said the impact that this has had on him. 2 other mothers from California were there that lost their children. These stories just continue on and on and on. My point is this: it all started with the Republicans, and the Democrats continued the effort. And now it's shifted back to the Republicans. The many victims in the United States and around the world are hoping that with the current leadership, this effort to protect passengers will be seen as a bipartisan issue and move forward like the original legislation passed in 2010. How will the cruise lines respond to this ask that we have for more legislation? They'll say we are highly regulated. That is their standard phrase. Well, in March of 2014, the National Transportation Safety Board had a meeting. The IMO came to that meeting and made a presentation. I can give you that presentation if you'd like, but I'm going to quote from one of the slides that said, "The role and function of the IMO. The IMO is not a policeman. The IMO does not implement anything, develop standards for strength, or determine design requirements, approve equipment and systems, and have any sanctions." That is from a direct quote from their PowerPoint presentation. Therefore, it's up to the United States to protect our citizens, since flag states have taken no action for victims of crimes on cruise ships. We ask your support in working with the regulations that have been our preliminary regulations, and we ask for your support in the passage of the additional legislation that has been submitted. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we start, I'm asking unanimous consent from us that the following materials be included in the record of today's hearing: a letter from the South Carolina Ports Authority, a letter from JBS USA Food Company, a written statement for the record from Ms. Linda D. Sanford, a letter from Mr. William Plord, President and CEO of El Toro Export. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Garamundi and go have a coughing fit outside, and I'll be right back.
Very good. Mr. Allegretti, you spoke of the Jones Act and potential legislation from other committees. Could you be more direct as to what you fear going on in other committees?
Today, the Natural Resources Committee is holding a markup of various provisions that may find their way into the Puerto Rico relief bill. And reports last night were that an amendment dealing with the Jones Act was poised to be offered.
In the Natural Resources Committee?
Natural Resources Committee.
Seems to be beyond their jurisdiction.
You would think so. And I will say that Your subcommittee, Mr. Ranking Member, the full committee have been clear and resolute, and we very much appreciate your vocal support for the law and your clarity with the other committees that you intend to maintain your jurisdiction over this vital law.
Thank you for that. I understand that the provisions of the Jones Act do not apply to the Virgin Islands. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the cost of fuel on the Virgin Islands is therefore cheaper than the cost of fuel at Puerto Rico? I've been told by the representative from the Virgin Islands that that is not the case, that in fact the cost of fuel in the Virgin Islands is substantially higher than the cost of fuel in the Virgin Islands. Do you know if that's true or not?
I don't know specifically if that's true, but I will tell you this. This is exactly the kind of debate that takes place with respect to the Jones Act, that someone takes a particular data point and then tries to make that a larger point about the effect of the Jones Act on a particular territory or locality, when in fact, oftentimes the transportation costs have absolutely nothing to do with the delivered price of the cargo. It has to do with supply, demand, and all kinds of other things unrelated to waterborne transportation.
Well, if the representative is correct, apparently she is, and she lives there and buys fuel in the Virgin Islands, that it's not the Jones Act issue.
Yes, sir.
That raises the cost, but other matters. Yeah, I represent a big agricultural district. For the life of me, I'm not quite sure I understand why we are in such a quandary about this business of tare weights. It appears as though it might be the liability issue. Is that correct, Ms. Lem?
We believe that.
So the liability issue revolves around the question of the tare weight written on the side of the container.
Correct.
So if we want to solve this problem, we could, are there other issues besides that?
There are issues. I mean, let's take the issue of the tare weight itself. The carriers have said themselves that the tare weights are often inaccurate. We have members who have run their own tests to prove that the tare weights that are stenciled on the side of the container are not accurate based on their data.
Within what range of accuracy or lack of accuracy? 5%, 10%, 100% off?
Roughly 10 to 12%. But here's the issue.
And the container weighs how much?
The container, let's take a 40-foot standard, generally around 8,000 pounds.
And 10%?
800 pounds. But here's the deal. What is bothering the shipper, the ag shipper, is that we have never been responsible for this tare weight before. The issue.
I get it, and I don't have that much time, but.
Okay.
But it's, your principal concern has to do with the liability. Okay. So there's something printed on the side that gives you the tare weight. And if it's not, if the gross rate is not accurate, then you fear that you are going to be held liable if there's some accident or something happens along the line. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So really it has to do with not being liable. Well, we could deal with that, but I suppose a court case could also deal with it. Okay. Are there any other issues beyond this liability issue?
It's the administrative task of having to report equipment we don't own or lease.
Okay, that takes us back to the liability.
Okay.
So we're really stuck on that.
Well, and its cost. We talked too about IT programming. Please remember, for decades, we have only reported the gross weight of our cargo.
Well,
and now we're being asked to report the weight, the tare weight of that empty container.
That would involve, I think my granddaughter now does that kind of mathematics in kindergarten.
Well, we move thousands and thousands of containers that are transloaded every day. And so we have a timing issue. For us to sit and look to the side of the container and actually record the side of the container and that tare weight and then have to report it and certify it, time and energy. I think it boils down to, we are told that the practice that we're doing today is compliant. It is compliant. And if it is in compliance with the regulation, then we're asking, Why can't we continue to do what we're
You are
doing?
essentially asking this committee to somehow sort out this issue of who's responsible for the tear weight.
Actually, no. What we're asking the committee is the changes are so drastic in reporting, in either A, scaling, or B, in the way we report VGM. It's also a timing issue. There's a new cutoff. Please remember that the verified gross mass now will require certification. They are programming for a whole new certificate for a database. And so if, in fact, there is a new cutoff that is given to the U.S. Ag shipper, that cutoff must be before that container rolls into the gate for that terminal operator. We are transloading constantly at a minute's notice. The fear is that the cutoff will be moved up another day, losing a whole nother day to transload export goods, time and money. And so we believe that it is an administrative function. The carrier already knows the weight of their container.
Okay. Mr. Carrier, Mr. Butler, what do we got going here?
Mr. Garamendi, let me address a couple of things in order, if I may. First of all, Ms. Lim started by saying that this was a regulation that was announced by the World Shipping Council. We're a trade association. This regulation was adopted by the International Maritime Organization with the participation of all the governments of that organization, including the United States. So it's the law. So we have to follow it. We need cooperation from our customers so that we can all be in compliance. Secondly, on this issue of tear weight, on the legal issue, I do address that in my written testimony. We take this as a non-issue. I've said it in public. Many of our members have said it in public. No one's going to hold a shipper liable for any inaccuracy of the tear weight of the container. That's our equipment. We put that number there, and if there's a problem associated with it, that's for us. The other thing I would say about the method number 2, where the tear weight...
Excuse me, at that point, can we make sure that's in the testimony, because some trial lawyer is going to want to come back and look at that?
And they're welcome to. Yeah.
Thank you.
The other thing I would just mention about the tear weight, it only comes up in this method number 2, where you put the two pieces together, you don't weigh the whole container. That was put in at the request of shippers. It wasn't this set of shippers, but it was a shippers group at the IMO that asked for that additional way of complying with the regulation. So it was an accommodation. You don't have to use it.
Okay. We can go round and round. I just want to get this little piece on the record. I see the chairman's back, and you want to take it from here?
I'm going to yield to Mr. Sanford.
I thank the chairman. I guess I want to go back to your comment earlier on the Jones Act with questions on that front. I think it's interesting that I actually pulled the numbers here. I guess my query would be this. If it's good enough for the United States military to trust change on that front, why shouldn't it be good enough for the rest of the country from the standpoint of looking at security? What I mean by that is this. If you look at the Maritime Administration's Ready Reserve Fleet, a full 30 of their 46 RRF ships are foreign built. In other words, they don't comply with the Jones Act. Yet they have exemptions at the federal level based on DOD needs, and yet oftentimes the argument is used, well, we need the Jones Act from the standpoint of national security. But the national security entity of our country, the DOD, has said, no, we really don't need that. We trust foreign flag ships to transport war materials from the United States to the Middle East. Why, if it's good enough for the DOD, is it not good enough for the United States from the standpoint of national security? But they do the opposite. I mean, again, I look at the numbers here. 30 of the 46 ships in the RRF fleet don't comply with Jones Act.
have all spoken recently and vocally on this matter, that it will denigrate the national security of the United States to allow foreign vessels to move our domestic commerce.
I hear you, but again, their actions speak otherwise. Let me try a different bite at the apple. So I pull the numbers. I don't know that we would view GAO as a bias source. I mean, everybody has their bias, but the Government Accounting Office, I think, would be a fairly reliable source. And their numbers indicate, based on a report that I have here in front of me, that it, in essence, costs double to send a 20-foot container from the east coast of the United States to San Juan, Puerto Rico, than it would to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, literally just a few sea miles away if you look at the transit distance, whether you're going out of New Jersey or Charleston or for that matter, Miami. And so you're actually looking at a doubling of cost. So you could look at security within the confines of DOD perspective and whether or not foreign flagged is acceptable from the standpoint of their security concerns or not. But you could also look at security from the standpoint of the economy. And if you look at that kind of impact, for instance, in that one quadrant, as it impacts San Juan, I'm looking here, and for instance, according to their Farm Bureau in Puerto Rico, the rate of difference in the Jones Act carrier and foreign carriers has led farmers and ranchers on the island to more often source animal feed and crop fertilizer from foreign sources than U.S. sources because of, again, the difference in cost. I look at here a report I saw just a moment ago from a state senator in Hawaii talking about the difference in shipping cost. A 40-foot container from L.A. to Shanghai costs around $790 at the time of this report, which was May 22nd, 2014, versus the cost to ship that same container from Los Angeles to Honolulu, $8,700. Again, basically a tenfold increase. And so you look at those kinds of increases, whether it's in Puerto Rico, which is in the news, or Honolulu, which is not in the news, you're looking at multiples of cost from the standpoint of shipping cost, which then does, at an economic level, begin to affect our national security. What would be your thoughts there?
I would tell you, sir, that I think that's a very narrow reading of the Jones Act benefits and the costs, and I'm not familiar with the particular numbers that you are citing. I am familiar with the most recent report done by GAO, which was designed to look specifically at the cost of moving cargo to Puerto Rico, and the essential result of that was they were not able to reach a firm conclusion about the cost differential. And here's why. The difference that you look at when you look at those two numbers is you're comparing apples to oranges. You're looking at an American vessel crewed with American mariners operating under the laws of the United States, and that's the cost basis for that vessel. You compare that to a foreign vessel that is not in compliance with any of those laws, any of our societal norms, and so their cost basis is lower. So if you were to allow them into the U.S. domestic trade, would you allow them to transport domestic cargo outside of our laws, or would you apply our laws to them? And so if you're going to apply our laws to them, I'd argue to you that their cost basis goes up, and thus so does their transportation rate.
I hear you. I see my time has expired, but I would simply, I guess, make this point, which is the question is how many of those different laws, in other words, whether it's from the standpoint of a fully unionized labor force. Many of the companies out of the Northeast or the upper Midwest have come to a place like South Carolina because of a different type workforce. I don't know that that is absolutely essential to the creation of any product in the domestic United States. I would also, I guess, make this point, which is I suspect you've traveled on foreign flagged air carriers and done so quite comfortably. They may not have all the same standards that we do have in America, but the fact is, if you've been in Germany or you've been in the Far East or you've been in Asia and you've traveled on a Boeing jet that happens to be, running in a different part of the world with a bit different standard, you feel relatively comfortable doing that, or you don't take the flight. I don't know that I'd completely agree with your reasoning, but I see I'm out of time and to be continued. With that, I'd yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. And if anybody wants to really look at the national security implications of a defense industrial base and a shipping industrial base, we have tons of testimony that Mr. Forbes, who's chairman of the Sea Power and Force Projection Subcommittee on Armed Services, we go through this all the time. And just for the record, the RRF, the Ready Reserve Fleet, and the MSP fleet are all U.S. flag, U.S. crewed. They're not Jones Act ship, meaning that they're not built in the U.S., but they're U.S. flag, U.S. crewed vessels. And DOD is also subject to to use 100% of their movement of cargo on U.S. flag, U.S. crewed vessels. They get waivers, unfortunately, every now and then when they shouldn't.
But they get lots of waivers, if I'm not mistaken.
They do, but they screw up all the time. Like we had an incident yesterday, truly, where you had a U.S. flag, U.S. crewed vessel sitting off the port waiting for cargo that got subcontracted to a foreign vessel that's going to be late because Transcom screwed up. So just for the record, in the end, I like to say this: it's not necessarily about the Jones Act and the requirements. The cargo preference laws that we have are not. It's not an economic thing. It truly isn't. It's about national security, because when you have to start making ships and crewing those ships in times of war, when we go to war, you have to have U.S. crews to do that. If you don't have U.S. flag vessels, you don't have U.S. crews to crew them, and once you lose that ability, it's gone. It's gone forever.
Agreed, and I would always defer to you on military issues. But having said that, I think the question is, do we have to have the same standard of security in shipping a container, a 20-foot container, carrying fertilizer from the East Coast in Charleston down to Puerto Rico?
I will yield to the gentleman. Go ahead, Mr.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we place into the record here the testimony from a recent hearing that the Sea Power Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee had on this issue of the Jones Act. I will paraphrase very, very briefly a piece of it, or all of it. And this came from Transcom and from MARAD. The testimony was the Jones Act is absolutely essential for national security. And without the Jones Act, the military cannot have a reliable and available shipment by sea. That testimony was extensive. Mr. Forbes asked a series of questions, as did I. Those questions completely would be of most interest to you, to the gentleman from South Carolina, with regard to the Jones Act. I'll make that available to you, and I would ask that that testimony be placed in the record here.
I would yield to the gentleman if you have any more to talk about it. I actually don't know what to think about the container weight issue. I don't think this is a congressional issue. I don't think there's not going to be legislation. I think this is a deal that needs to be worked out between the shippers and the shippees. Right? I don't think there's a legislative answer for this, because according to the U.S. Coast Guard, which would be the ones who would regulate this, correct? In a legal battle, who would be the overseers of people, of the farmers and shippers and the carriers? Meaning, who would administer it? Who would have oversight?
Mr. Chairman, the U.S. Coast Guard, excuse me, is the sole U.S. agency with that authority.
And the U.S. Coast Guard has not taken a position on this yet, correct?
I don't want to speak, pardon me.
Well, how about I tell you, the U.S. Coast Guard has not taken a position on this yet.
Correct. What they have said is that there are many different ways to do this. And frankly, the discussion that's been going on back and forth between the carriers and the shippers is not really so much about, what's legally required. It's about how do we do this in a way that we can keep commerce moving. And there are certain ways of doing this if we have a uniform process that's going to make it, particularly with a deadline coming up July 1, it's going to make it a lot more likely that we have a smooth process if we all do it the same way. If everybody comes in
Let
and
me ask
wants
you
to
this,
do-
here's what I don't understand. What happens until now? I mean, everybody, when you get on an airplane, the luggage gets weighed, they have to know how much stuff weighs, same with ships, right? You gotta know what stuff weighs, so you can load the ship properly, right? So what's been happening until now in the United States? Forget the world.
It's a bit of a mix. Today, carriers use various sources of weights in order to stow the ship. Sometimes they use the weight from the shipper. Sometimes experience says that the weight from the shipper is unfortunately inaccurate, and they have to disregard that. In that case, they may use the in-gate weight when a truck comes across through the gate into the port. In some cases, frankly, carriers have, excuse me, default weights for certain commodities. They know essentially what it's going to weigh, and they'll use that. But too many times, and I've talked to lots of our carriers, they're involved in this, and over the years, far too many times, the weights are simply inaccurate.
Are containers not standard? Or do they differ?
Well, containers, sure, they're standard sizes, but they differ. Any given run of manufacturing of containers, there's going to be some differences between the container weights. They will fall within a range.
How big of a range? I mean, I would guess it's pretty close, right?
Generally, yes.
So what does the Coast Guard say now? A 5% variance is fine?
The Coast Guard hasn't announced a numeric variance.
All right, what is the international standard for variance?
There's not an international standard. The UK,
All right,
for
where did
example.
5% come from then?
5% came from the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And that's being discussed in Europe. It's being discussed in other places. And that's an enforcement variance.
What is their deadline?
Everybody's deadline is the same.
For the
July
world?
1.
And
July
Chairman
1.
Hunter, I'd just like to say that
ma'am.
only 10 countries have even taken a position. 10 of 171 countries that are affiliated with the IMO have taken a position on this. I'd also like to say that the Coast Guard has been very clear that this is not a new regulation. I meant to say that the World Shipping Council has issued guidelines without flexibility. The Coast Guard has also been clear that there is flexibility, and there are multiple ways in which we can report gross mass. Historically, gross mass has been reported by the shipper to the carrier. The responsibility has been the carrier to the master to report accurate weights. This VGM is a new term. Never before heard it before until a few months ago. Verified gross mass now replaces the term gross mass. And in its replacement of gross mass, it totally replaces the way we have for decades reported weights. The shipper has forever reported the gross weight of their cargo and never had to report also the tare weight of an empty container that they don't own or lease. One thing that I failed to say in my final summary, that if in fact these changes are mandated and they're regulatory changes, then we have to follow and ask the Coast Guard for a rulemaking, an official rulemaking. Now, I believe the Coast Guard in good faith really thought we could just work it out, that in a commercial setting we could dialogue. But unfortunately, the margins are so thin on our agricultural commodities, we can't afford a $250 scale. One shipper believes it's going to cost to his bottom line $4 million if we're forced to scale. This is a major U.S. shipper.
When you say scale, you mean $250 every time you weigh?
A container. It's a lot of money on super thin margins for our exports. And we feel that that is burdensome, and the option, frankly, for most is a no-go.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Butler. Why? I mean, this is the U.S. Congress. We have 80 U.S. flag vessels that sail internationally. 60 of them are MSP, so they get stipend, right? So we got about 20. Is that about right? We got about 20 vessels that aren't MSP that are internationally, that are U.S. flag international cargo vessels. So why should we here put a burden on our shippers when it's more of an international issue than it is our issue? Meaning, why should we worry about the international carriers as opposed to the U.S. fleet? And the U.S. economy, the U.S. businesses, and the people that are actually making things and then exporting them, which is that's very few. We don't export a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of ag stuff. We aren't China, obviously. We're not a lot of other countries that export a bunch of stuff. So why is this an issue for Congress?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't think it is an issue for Congress.
Well, then why are you here?
I think this is because I was invited to come.
I mean, but what I'm saying, I mean, why are we talking about this? And if you're saying that you might want legislative action
I'm saying,
if things aren't
please,
solved.
well, what we'd like to do is to continue the practice that we're doing today. We'd like to meet the carrier halfway by saying we'll certify again, yet again, the gross weights of our cargo under contract, or perhaps when we send our shippers instructions for that master bill of lading, a checkbox and a signature that we verify our weights to be true and accurate.
Yeah, I'm missing something then. What's wrong? How is that different than what you're asking for?
It's not what we're asking for, sir. It's what's in the regulation.
Okay, well,
And the question,
how is it different than what the regulations are asking for, what you just said?
it depends on what the shipper's doing today. If the shipper today is weighing the cargo and providing us a full weight of the loaded container, then they're already in compliance.
Then that's it.
Right? Ms. Lem has talked about the added cost of weighing things. Well, if you're not weighing things today, how do you know how much it weighs?
I think she's saying is they don't weigh the container that's full, right? They weigh their stuff.
Right,
They know what that weighs.
which takes us back to this method two, which we discussed a little bit while you were outside of the room, and the concern that's been raised there by shippers, a small number of shippers, but some shippers, is legal liability for taking the weight that's painted on the door of the container and adding that to the contents. And what I said at that time is we've been very clear. The carriers aren't looking to hold shippers liable for a weight that we wrote on the door of the container. That's on us. But it was put in the regulation as an accommodation to shippers so that they could use method number two and not have to go find a scale to weigh.
And method two, again, is weighing your products outside of the container, right? And then adding that
Tear
weight
weight.
that's on the,
And
Correct.
we contend that if in fact we have to certify C, which is VGM, A being gross weight of our cargo, plus B, tear weight of their cargo. Don't worry about it, Mr. Shipper, you're not liable, but sign here, C, verified gross mass. That any part of that equation then ties us to that certification. We're also asking about the administrative function. Why would we be asked? We've heard the carriers say, one, tear weight is insignificant. Anybody, yes, a second grader can read that, the sides of the container. We're asking, why would you burden the U.S. exporter, who is already at an all-time low with U.S. exports? Why would you burden them with another administrative function that's not necessary? Why would you ask them to report on the tear weight of a container when you own it? You already know it's in your database. They are, the World Shipping Council, several members have suggested we go to their website to pull the container weight if we don't want to look at the sides of the containers. We're contending, come on, guys, why are we making this harder than it is? You've already said it's insignificant. You've already said what you really want to look at is that gross weight. We agree. It should be reported accurately, and that's the only thing we as U.S. shippers have control over.
I'm trying to get my hands around this. If the Coast Guard is not going to enforce the new regulation, what do you contend with that then? If they're gonna say the way things are, it complies. The way things are now complies with this regulation. That's basically what they're saying. The Coast Guard's not demanding that anybody do anything differently, correct?
I think actually, Mr. Chairman, that's not correct. What I heard today from Admiral Thomas is there are lots of ways of complying with this regulation in terms of your processes and so forth, but he did say that because of the amendments to the regulation, there will be changes in business processes, and there will be. And carriers have spent millions of dollars around the world reconfiguring their systems so that we can efficiently process this information in conformance with the regulation. And the hope is that in setting up these new processes and getting more accurate weight, we will have safer vessels to carry the commerce of the world and also of the United States, to your original point.
Mr. Garamondi.
I don't know if this is the correct panel, but I'm back to viable and dead. And I don't know if anybody here wants to comment on it, but it seems to me that the problem we're having with this discharge, and I guess there are the shippers here, so Mr. Butler, you're going to be on here in a moment. The problem is that we can verify dead, and we can replicate that test that it's dead, but we can't get down to viable or whatever, inherently rendered harmless, whatever. Why don't we just say dead and be done with it? And apparently the systems are out there that can kill it.
Well, a couple of things. The systems may be out there. The problem is we don't know. No systems, and the Admiral spoke to this earlier, no systems have yet been type approved by the United States. What that means is nobody has yet come in with test data that shows dead all the time.
I didn't hear it that way. And I think we need to go back and go back over this again, and I will after the hearing. I heard it that it's the viable or non-viable issue that they're not able to replicate, but that they can replicate and have high level of certainty that it's dead.
I think I can clear that up. I think he was talking about two things. One is how many systems today have been type approved by the U.S. Coast Guard. The answer is 0. Okay? With respect to the test, you're correct, sir. He said we can tell when something's dead. We're not so sure we can tell when it's viable. From a carrier standpoint, operating globally, what we want to know is when we put a system on a ship, and these things are not cheap, when we put a system on a ship, we want it to work and be recognized every place in the world. And we want to know that we have investment certainty that if we spend that $1 million, $2 million per ship to do this, it's going to have some environmental benefit, and we can count on being in compliance.
And what we're saying is that at the issue is what is compliance? What is compliant? What the Admiral said was that our method, our current method is compliant, and what we're suggesting is the problem is that the World Shipping Council and its members are telling us dogmatically, we can't accept your current compliant method. You have to do one of these two other methods. These carriers.
We're talking two different things here. I've moved over to.
It's analogous, maybe.
It is analogous in my mind. It's a circle.
Well, then just, I'm into creatures of the sea.
No, I understand.
Okay. And just hold it for a second, because we're going to be out of time here in a few moments. Yeah, I need to go back, and I will talk to the Admiral about the tests themselves, and we don't have the companies that manufacture or purport to manufacture the equipment. But I think I need to get into it in more detail. I think at this moment, I'm headed down the line that it is the viable issue or non-viable issue that is hanging everything up here, and that the technologies may be available to kill, as in dead, creatures that might be in the ballast water. Mr. Butler, final comment on that, then I've got.
Final comment is that would provide certainty to everybody, and on this issue, certainty would be most welcome.
Thank you. Man overboard surveillance. This issue is an issue requirement for cruise ships to install a system to monitor and detect incidents where a person falls overboard. Mr. Carver, you said there are a couple of technologies that seem to be available for this.
There may be more than two, but I listed in my written testimony 2 companies that have systems that have been tested. In 2011, the Coast Guard asked for proposals on man overboard systems they got them, but to the best of my knowledge, they never contacted the companies that issued the proposals to validate their proposal. And so I've often asked them.
In
"Why
your
did
written
you-"
testimony, which I must have missed, did you name the companies?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Well, David's going to contact them.
Good.
We're going to see what those systems are and whether they really do work. And then if they do, or at least they purport to do, we'll do that. I assume that witnesses here are not into man overboard issues. Okay. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you all for being here, and thanks for staying a little bit extra time. We talked about a lot of things today, and I'm not even going to rehash everything. There are no further questions. There's nobody else here but me and John. So with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Wow.
I don't know that I haven't. Yeah, you guys, Peter and I have to go tracking the issues. I don't know how it all played out, but.
Hey, I'm Donna.
Yeah, Mike Dunlap. Keys Group representing you.
Oh, yes, of course. Nice to see you.
Yep, I gotta run to another meeting, but we'll chat.
No. Hey, how are you?
To meet you in person at long last. Nice to get out of that chair, isn't it? It's never a real pleasure. We always say it's a pleasure to be here, and in fact, it's actually not a pleasure to be in this seat. It's a great carpet. Yeah, it is. Hang in. It's good to meet you.
Are you like any discussion?
They know how to do it, and they're ready to do it. Hey, hi, nice to see you. Hey, how you doing? You're in the breach again, maybe more than you need.
Someday they'll have to explain what you guys are talking about.
You know.